Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give it just another minute. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Professor Claire Dita. I'm director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. So the UC San Diego Center for Comparative Immigration Studies and the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration are pleased to present today's talk, which is entitled Detention Empire by Dr. Tina Shull. Dr. Shull is Associate Professor and Director of Public History at UNC Charlotte. And her book takes a critical look at the intersection between the rise of modern migrant detention policy and the global war on drugs in the 1980s and the resistance movements that these policies created. We're grateful to have her. We're also grateful to have our discussant, Professor of Law at UCLA, Ingrid Eagly, an expert on immigrant enforcement and criminal justice policy. Today's talk is organized as follows. Dr. Shull will present her book for about 25 minutes. Dr. Eagly will then comment for about 10 minutes, and then we'll give Dr. Shull an opportunity to respond, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A, which I will moderate. All right. Dr. Shull, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And make sure that I can still see the chat. All right, everyone can see. I really want to thank you all for being here, and I want to share my immense gratitude for Claire and David at CCIS for extending this invitation, and Anna and Warren for the organizing efforts, and also Roger Waldinger at UCLA's Center for the Study of International Migration for co-sponsoring the event, and special thanks to Ingrid for serving as discussant and Claire for moderating. So I'm greeting you from UNC Charlotte, a name that gives a nod to the settler colonial origins of this Queen City, but it is unceded Catawba, Chera, Sugaree, and Waxhaw land. I ask you to join me in thinking about our responsibility in naming the legacies of settler colonialism, slavery, and extractivism in this nation's history, especially as they are the origins of displacement and forced migration, and have laid the foundations of our carceral and border systems, as well as fueling climate crisis. Critically reckoning with these histories is a project that's currently under threat, making it all the more crucial in our efforts towards social and environmental justice. My book, Detention Empire, opens with two interwoven stories. One is of a hunger strike at the California detention facility called Adelanto in 2017. In the desert outside of Los Angeles, Adelanto has been one of the largest in the US since it opened in 2011 and is run by for-profit operator, the Geo Group. Began by 9 men who were part of a Central American refugee caravan that arrived at the US-Mexico border in search of asylum, the hunger strike met brutal retaliation, assault, solitary confinement, and for some, deportation. On June 20th, World Refugee Day, a group of advocates and lawyers attempted to visit those on hunger strike, but were deemed a threat and not allowed in the facility went on lockdown. This story is a microcosm of cycles of resistance and retaliation in detention that have played out over and over across decades and continue today. A coalition of actors inside Adelanto and allies on the outside also introduces connections between Caribbean and Central American asylum-seeking groups who have faced exceptional discrimination in the system since the 1980s, and questions about the role and impacts of activism on the outside. The book also opens with another story, my own. The same month that I was accepted to a PhD program at UC Irvine in 2007, my former husband was detained in a for-profit facility in New Jersey and soon deported. For me, studying the history of detention has always been personal. At first, I set out to tell the story of the rise of private prisons in the 1980s and why they first emerged in an immigration context. I consulted government archives to seek a top-down understanding of the US's embrace of detention. But as I researched, I also began to work with and support people facing deportation, and I found a larger story. I encountered patterns of resistance and retaliation in my research in the 1980s that mirrored my own witnessing and experiences in the 2010s. I was struck by how repetitive these patterns are across time and place, and how central a perceived threat of migration, especially from the Caribbean and Central America, was in Reagan's policymaking. I also saw a pattern of official lies emerge, and how detention was a site of solidarity and resistance, but also of silence. So over the last 4 decades, migrant detention rates in the US have increased 1,000-fold to reach a record height of 55,000 people detained per day under the Trump administration in 2020. Although the COVID pandemic curbed detention numbers, they've been climbing back up to nearly 40,000 a day where they are today. COVID also worsened already horrific conditions in detention, sparking a new wave of hunger strikes and a growing movement to abolish ICE. And today, migrant detention remains a multi-billion-dollar industry. People are held in over 200 local, federal, and private facilities across the country at an annual cost of nearly $3 billion or $8 million a day, average of $142 per person. Although abusive conditions in detention continue to make headlines, they also always seem to recede into a business as usual background. Cycles of media attention, public outcry, political organizing, and litigation chip away at aspects of the system, yet it continues on. Interrogating how and why this is so was a central impetus for writing this book. Some of the questions that initially drove my research are, what is the relationship between immigration and foreign policy making? How do these relate to longer histories of race and empire and gender? And how does immigration enforcement and this rapid growth of the detention system relate to the rise of mass incarceration in the United States more broadly? And then what is the context and significance of new enforcement policies adopted in the early 1980s? Detention Empire zeroes in on the early 1980s as a critical turning point in the history of immigration enforcement and the rise of mass incarceration in an era of neoliberalism and counterinsurgent military operations in Latin America. A formative event known as the Mariel Cuban boat lift, a large-scale migration of 125,000 Cubans to South Florida during the summer of 1980, alongside increasing arrivals of Haitian and Central American asylum seekers, galvanized new modes of covert warfare in the Reagan administration's globalized war on drugs as a response to a perceived immigration crisis. A central argument of the book is that detention operates as a form of counterinsurgency at the intersections of US foreign policy and domestic prison trends. Rather than a mere domestic or peripheral foreign policy issue, immigration is central to foreign policy making and to driving the rise of mass incarceration. In the book, I zoom in on detention sites across the US and acts of resistance from inside to trace how the Reagan administration developed a set of retaliatory enforcement measures enacted in specific response to these 3 asylum-seeking groups, and that laid foundations of new forms of carceral and imperial expansion, entrenching what I call a detention empire. These new enforcement measures included the systematic detention of asylum seekers, drug and immigrant interdiction programs, the militarization of a more broadly imagined US border, and prison privatization. Together, these policies buttress a supercharged system of criminalized migration, surveillance, detention, and deportation, undergirded by logics of border enforcement that resistance and immigrant rights movements have yet to effectively really slow, reform, or abolish. Counterinsurgent or counter-revolutionary warfare has a long racialized history in US. It is deeply embedded in US foreign policy and interventions in Latin America, which have shaped contemporary migration patterns. As historians such as Stuart Schrader, Jordan T. Camp, and Rachel Ida Buff have shown, the US's embrace of counterinsurgency not only enforces a post-war global capitalist order, but has also underwritten prison and policing trends back home. I define US empire as the state's commission of transnational violence in order to sustain itself. This violence has taken many forms, including war or covert war and political violence, poverty via labor and economic coercion, race, sex, and gender-based violence, ecocide, and theft of indigenous land and sovereignty. As multitudes of violence set in motion by histories of US imperialism manifest in scales of mass migration, detention exacts violence on a scale of migrant bodies. It is, to use historian Greg Grandin's phrase, empire's workshop, a place where the violent ends of empire are reified and then rendered invisible. Detention Empire challenges two popular misconceptions about the Reagan administration. First, that it was soft or softer on immigration than subsequent administrations. And second, that Reagan's right turn faced little public protest. Over time, intertwining US settler colonial and imperial projects have laid foundations of what I call the carceral palimpsest. Palimpsest is a term in textual and architectural studies referring to inscriptions of new writing or design practices over old ones that still remain visible. And it's a helpful concept, I think, for understanding prisons and imprisonment as episodic reinscriptions of white nationalist state-making, layered atop one another as old and new features fuse and function across detention sites. While Detention Empire focuses on how US responses to three specific migrant groups shaped detention policy in the Reagan era, I acknowledge the foundations laid by policing and immigration enforcement's historical targeting of Black, Native, Chinese, Mexican and Filipino, and Japanese American populations in particular, especially in the creation of the Border Patrol, categories of non-citizenship, and spaces of detention which were pre-existing and built upon under Reagan. At heart, cycles of resistance and state retaliation and detention are a battle over truth. In writing the book, I was inspired by James Scott and Robin D.G. Kelly's conception of hidden transcripts of resistance, which show how grassroots organizing shapes decision-making at the top levels of government. Reading beyond government archives that tell an official story that justifies state violence and casts migrations and social movements as a threat, I also draw on community-created, unofficial archives, protest artifacts, and oral histories to show how migrants resisted repression at every turn. Throughout the 1980s, people in detention and allies on the outside, including legal advocates, Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, and the Central American peace and sanctuary movements, organized hunger strikes, caravans, and uprisings. I define resistance as a range of efforts to hold the state accountable for its abuses and to counter detention's silencing effects. In turn, ongoing contestations over the visibility of migrants, living testimony of imperial violence, shape detention's retaliatory features and functions, mediating the visibility of, quote, undesirable migrant populations, and criticism of US foreign policy became central to the Reagan administration's goals of containing communism and maintaining economic dominance in the Caribbean and Latin America, and militarizing law and border enforcement in its renewed war on drugs at home. As protests from detention, amplified by inside, outside, and coalitional organizing, met increasing state retaliation, new enforcement policies were accompanied by a language of counterinsurgency meant to obscure the impacts of US foreign policy and silence opposition. Few presidents are better known for their masterful rhetoric and ability to define themselves in opposition to their enemies as Ronald Reagan. As governor of California from 1967 to 1975, Reagan developed a revanchist politics or revenge politics in response to civil rights, student, anti-war, and labor movements. In the White House, the Reagan administration drew upon these prior battles to wage a new war on migrant rights. I use the term Reagan imaginary to describe Reagan's worldview, shaped by neoconservative politics, neoliberal economics, and longstanding mythologies of settler colonialism. The Reagan imaginary is a vision and a strategy of white nationalist state-making. Even though he decried big government, he ran on a platform of resurgent nationalism, drawing harder lines against communism and crime, reassuring an increasingly anxious public that had waning confidence after the Vietnam War in a time of economic recession. Reagan made seemingly contradictory promises on immigration, which may explain why his administration is often mistakenly remembered as being soft on the issue. He courted migrant hiring industries and the Hispanic vote by speaking of a peaceful US-Mexico border and touted the US as a beacon of freedom that embraced refugees fleeing communism, while at the same time giving nods to vigilante violence in the borderlands and US-backed Central American civil wars. Upon entering office in 1981, he considered securing the nation's borders both a Cold War priority and an emergency, and targeted the Caribbean Basin, a region that he dubbed the US's third border, strategically merging immigration control with criminal and communist threats, Cold War geopolitical strategy, and exploitative neoliberal free trade agreements. One of Reagan's first moves in office was to create an immigration task force, and he assigned the Attorney General's office to find new ways to deter migration specifically from the Caribbean and Latin America. He also formed a task force on violent crime, which led to his administration launching a new war on drugs. While mainly understood as a program of domestic law enforcement and credited for growing the prison system, the global and immigration dimensions of the war on drugs are crucial for understanding the growth of border militarization and mass incarceration, as the Reagan administration aimed to curb migration by strengthening cooperation and intelligence gathering between local, federal, and military police forces and allied governments. As Reagan's Associate Attorney General, Rudy Giuliani served on both task forces and became a central figure in strengthening Reagan's immigration detention policies. Anti-Blackness and homophobia surrounding Cuban and Haitian migrants especially also converged with Reagan's dog-whistling signaling on race, deviance, and crime that predominantly targeted African Americans. The Mariel Cuban migration and the political fallout of their detention on US military bases took on mythic proportions as this singular event became an enduring symbol of migration crisis, shaping policy even through the Trump administration. Giuliani was the architect of new detention policies that hastened crimmigration trends, including the administration's 1982 Mass Immigration Emergency Plan, tailored to a Mariel-type scenario and further justified by increasing arrivals of Haitian, quote, boat people and Central American, quote, feet people. And this is language of the Reagan policymakers. This preemptive contingency plan for establishing detention space for 10 to 20,000 migrants in the event of a migration crisis would serve as a blueprint for detention building across the US Sun Belts, South and West and beyond. Piecing together hidden transcripts, Detention Empire connects landscapes of resistance against the Reagan administration across detention sites. Detained Cuban, Haitian, and Central American migrants wielded their bodies and voices to reclaim freedom and hold the state accountable for its abuses. Personal and collective protests took various forms, from letter writing, public petitions, and class action lawsuits, to creating alternate worlds through art, song, and poetry, to coordinating hunger strikes and riotous unrest. In 1987, Mariel Cuban, subjected to years of indefinite detention, staged a takeover and standoff at 2 prisons in Atlanta and Louisiana, spanning 15 days, the longest prison uprising in US history. Ongoing resistance created pressure within detention, while transnational solidarity activism opposing Reagan's foreign policies drew connections between conditions of confinement and global freedom struggles. This was seen in US-Cuba student solidarity formations, and advocacy on behalf of queer and trans Mariel Cubans detained on US military bases. In the feminist collective Off Our Backs, which supported Haitian women on hunger strike in facilities across the country and published their words. Or in Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugee caravans and speech acts mobilized by the sanctuary movement. Along with masterminding new immigration policies, Giuliani also played a pivotal role in developing retaliatory measures and counterinsurgent rhetoric aimed at neutralizing Reagan's opponents. After a hunger strike at the Chrome detention facility in Miami that drew international media attention and coalitional protests led by civil rights leader Jesse Jackson in 1981, the INS called in the Bureau of Prisons to help form a militarized Border Patrol tactical unit known as BORTAC, while Giuliani directed the INS and the FBI to monitor, quote, outside agitators. These scripts would play out again on a larger scale as these agencies harassed and prosecuted Central American peace and sanctuary movement activists, aided by Reagan's issuance of Executive Order 12333, which legalized domestic surveillance, quote, in support of national foreign policy objectives abroad. Giuliani monitored internal and public communications surrounding detention, refuting migrant and allied accounts of abuses in detention. Traveling to Haiti, he even forged diplomatic relations with Francois Duvalier's regime to lay groundwork for the Haitian interdiction program and justify the US's blanket rejection of Haitian asylum seekers. That mounting protests from detention and the sanctuary movement posed such a threat and raised alarm within the Reagan administration is instructive, I think both as a cautionary tale and for its abolitionist potential. As I researched Detention Empire, I began working with communities to document, archive, and mobilize stories from detention that defy prisons and borders, and the prose of counterinsurgency that sustains them. Coalitional efforts to document abuse and reverse erasure are crucial for building power and reckoning with the enduring xenophobia driving detention policies today. However, recovering and documenting stories may not always be enough. As a movement tactic, storytelling has been critiqued for lacking historical context, contributing to narratives of victimization or deservingness, trauma porn, some critics might call it, and sustaining neoliberal agendas. Indeed, some of the most radical critiques of sanctuary came from within the movement. I want to end with the words of Alejandro Rodriguez, a labor organizer who experienced torture at the hands of US-backed death squads. He fled El Salvador with his family and entered sanctuary in Rochester, New York. Speaking from sanctuary in 1985, he described his desire to, quote, deepen the work until the movement becomes more aware of itself and its people, with a real expression of its historic roots, unquote. Others living in sanctuary also urged allies to see it as a process of political education and of learning to make way for migrant voices and leadership. Detention Empire asks what can grow from seeds of resistance already planted and their interconnecting roots. I conclude that to end detention, different conceptions of migration may be necessary, aided by abolition feminist and critical refugee studies scholarship that rejects the premise of state sovereignty and foregrounds migrant journeys and life worlds as sites of critique, decolonization, and reparation. Stories from detention expose cracks in the architecture of detention itself, placing them alongside one another across time and place to build solidarity across groups and contexts can dismantle its foundational logic in its entirety. These visions are not new. As Alejandro Rodriguez concluded in 1985, the sanctuary movement must take the next step, which is a historic step, to forge an anti-investment solidarity movement. Ultimately, he was asking US audiences to divest from complicity in empire in all of its forms. Thank you. And here's a shameless plug for the book with a discount code.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shull. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Eagly for her comments.
Great, wonderful. It's so great to be here, and I want to thank Christina Shull for this wonderful book, Detention Empire. I think it was such a joy to read, and really is, I think, mandatory reading for anyone who's interested in detention studies, but also more broadly on the history of immigration enforcement, the intertwining between the immigration system and the criminal legal system and mass incarceration, sanctuary, grassroots, movement-based resistance, and lawyering against deportation. So many topics are covered so artfully, and the book is really beautifully authored and chronicled and a joy to read. The sources that she relies on are varied and wide-ranging, including archives, interviews, testimonies, non-government sources that really help us to, hear the voices of people impacted by detention. Throughout the book, I particularly appreciated, one of the central goals, which is to center those voices. The book successfully shows how migrants are, quote, knowledge producers, and how their testimonies have powerfully spoken out against state violence time and time again. The book also features a decade of the 1980s of the Reagan administration that I think has been underappreciated and underexplored in the scholarship, allowing us to make new connections and discover new things in the history. As Shull writes, migrant lives, journeys, and voices speak to the violence of immigration enforcement. Ultimately, I think the book succeeds beautifully in the goal of its title of showing, quote, how voices from detention and migration itself speak to U.S. empire. So I wanted to take the few minutes that I have to just highlight some of the themes in the book that spoke out to me. And just starting with the idea of detention as punishment. Having just yesterday taught to my students at the law school the Supreme Court's decision in Fang Yu Ting from 1893, in which the Supreme Court upheld the one white witness rule of Chinese exclusion and solidified the legal fiction that detention is not punishment. I found particularly wonderful in re-looking over the book last night, just how it shows that immigration detention does serve as a form of punishment, and its origin story is in fact deeply intertwined with the expansion of mass incarceration in the United States. In practice, detention looks and feels like prison, and the book documents in great detail the harsh conditions of these prisons. The denial of recreation, the lack of medical care, the use of countdowns and shakedowns, administrative detention, including solitary segregation that we normally would think of as reserved for the most severe of prisons, and the invention of $1-a-day wages. These prisons are also repeatedly relying on the use of transfers, which is where individuals are transferred from one facility to another. And as the book documents, oftentimes officers, or the agency will claim that this is due to overcrowding or some sort of administrative necessity. But advocates and people within detention whose voices come out in the book reveal that this was indeed rather could be retaliation against individuals who were labeled as troublemakers or who were engaging in protests, and also with the goal of ending access to legal aid and community organizing and support. The book features several detention centers that are crucial to the history of immigration detention ongoing today. And we learn about the history and creation of each of these centers, but also appreciate how each center serves as a site of resistance. In learning about El Centro in Southern California, the book makes clear that Salvadorians were not just passive recipients of mistreatment, but rather routinely raised awareness of their detention conditions. At Chrome in Miami, we learned how asylum seekers detained there engaged in hunger strikes and other protests, and also inside-out collaborations with residents who would stage demonstrations and protests outside the prison's walls. At Oakdale and in Atlanta, we learn about the uprisings that took place there in protest in 1987. This was also a period where private contracting emerges, although it was characterized as temporary or being for special groups or just for short-term detention. The book documents how these so-called short-term detention centers run by private contractors like the Tennessee Corrections Corporation of America and Florida's Wackenut Corporation have actually become sites of some of the worst human rights abuses that we've seen in detention. As a lawyer and legal scholar, I was particularly taken with how you document in the book that, quote, asylum claims can be a powerful site of resistance, and how you artfully zoom out from the lawyer's role in these cases to include that of giving testimony by migrants and the broader inside-out organizing efforts that have taken place around asylum claims. You show persuasively that legal victories for some asylum seekers have been routinely met by retaliatory tactics, such as in 1976, after parole and work authorization was obtained for many Haitian asylum seekers, INS adopted new retaliatory procedures that further expedited asylum proceedings. Or how, in response to a ruling from Judge King preserving rights to asylum and calling out the administration's Haitian removal policy as racist and discriminatory, INS simply resumed their deportation program in direct violation of the judge's order. Or how, after a preliminary injunction in the Orantes Hernandez versus Smith case that found that INS did systematically violate the rights of Salvadorians' due process rights in brutally requiring them or demanding that they waive their rights to asylum hearings, INS continued to systematically violate the terms of the injunction. In other words, I think the book shows how litigation has produced some good results, but also some bad results. Whereas there have been temporary legal victories and procedural rights have been gained, we've also seen the lengthening of detention times and the continuing development of more and more brutality in the administration's response to legal resistance. The book also discusses the importance of the sanctuary movement, which is defined as, sort of a coalition of groups that came out in the 1980s, including refugee groups, academics, religious groups, that employed a whole range of tactics, and it resulted in the founding of some organizations that have been vital in the movement, including El Rescate here in Los Angeles, as well as Proyecto Libertad in Port Isabel, Texas. The sanctuary movements, and connecting to one of the themes of the book, really did encourage migrants to tell their stories and documented those stories and featured those stories. At its height, there were over 500 churches and tens of thousands of supporters, as we learned in the book. But the book also acknowledges some of the pitfalls, just like the pitfalls of the legal organizing, of the tactics of sanctuary as well. Engaging in selective storytelling, featuring stories that might seem more appealing to certain audiences, and also giving what you call outside-sized coverage of some of the movement's white male leadership, when in fact the movement was quite diverse and included the active membership of migrants themselves. At the heart of the book is the important goal of really elevating the individual narratives of asylum seekers and persons who have been subjected to detention. Storytelling is what you call, quote, the public mobilization of firsthand accounts of state violence and migration. And I think you stay true to that by beginning by weaving in your own personal experience of being exposed to detention through the detention of a loved one, and that person's eventual deportation, and then bringing on your own story of engaging as a historian, becoming a historian to tell these stories, and the ongoing work that's informed your research through your collaborations with Freedom for Immigrants and other groups. The book shares powerful firsthand accounts of this state violence, of the inside-out through telling the stories of inside-out organizing, of hunger strikes, of sit-ins, of writings about experiences in detention, through newsletters, through poetry. And I also want to emphasize the powerful photographs, and other archival documents some of which you shared in the slides here today, that I think also bring voice to this storytelling. such as the handwritten drawing by a child of the migrant, a picture of the handwritten demands by Oakdale detainees, quote, "We want the people, the staff, the government to understand that we are asking for freedom in which we are rightly due." Or the powerful photograph of Cubans on the roof of the Atlanta Penitentiary in 1987 with a giant sign reading, "We do appreciate very much citizen support." You also discuss ongoing memory projects that are connecting past events to the present and past testimonies to current ones, and doing some work to counter some of the pitfalls of other organizing efforts, such as by disrupting the bad versus good immigrant narratives. So I'm going to end here again to thank you for the book, and I really look forward to hearing the comments and questions of the audience. If you do have time for any questions, I would be particularly interested in hearing what you're working on next, or what this research is leading to, because I know I will definitely be seeking out to follow your future work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was such beautiful comments on my book, providing so many more details than I was able to in my talk. So I'm just really, really humbled by your support. And Ingrid also provided comments. I participated in UCLA's Emerging Immigration Scholars Conference several years ago, probably 5 years ago at this point. So just thank you for that opportunity as well. I see a question in the Q&A that asks what my motivations were for writing the book, and I think that touches upon the comments as well. Initially, it was my former husband's detention and deportation and kind of experience through that. And at the same time that I was planning to go to grad school and study history, and while my former husband was detained, just kind of witnessing all of the lies that take place and this dystopian spaces of detention, where up is down and down is up. The law library that is in the facility has no books or no access to computers. The recreation is just a empty concrete room with no sunlight. And like one basketball, just things like that. So just like the terrible conditions, but even more the ways in which the stories that pierce through coalitions that are built, and even myself befriending, other friends and family of affected people and people in detention, and how we all shared contact information with each other, and we were all so sure that we were going to write a book together, we talked about, and we're going to document all of these injustices, and we're going to, publicize them to the world and to our elected representatives. And we were calling ICE, and we were writing letters, and ICE never answered the phone, and, elected representatives couldn't really be effective in, releasing people from detention. And that's where I got a lot of love for immigration lawyers, because of the power that they can have to, the levers that they can push in that space. But seeing how one by one, as people were deported from the facility, we just lost touch with each other. And we all kind of resolved that we would build power together, but then we all became deflated and silenced. I did publish an op-ed when my husband was detained that ran in, I think, the Chicago Tribune. It's a large national newspaper with a wide readership. And the very next day is when ICE decided, our case, that my husband would be deported. And was that an act of retaliation? I don't know, but I suspect so. And so kind of tracing that, and then in the current moment, in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, seeing those same patterns playing out, conditions in detention not changing from what I saw documented, in my archival research, and how much, the Reagan administration line, the official story, contrasted from what sanctuary movement members and the Speech Act testimonies of those who were in sanctuary, that were publicized very widely in the media. how much those contrasted. You know, those were some of the initial impetuses for me to write the book. And I really wanted to know for myself. I first had a personal vendetta against for-profit detention sites, core civic, geo group, these for-profit operators. You know, I really thought private prisons were the real problem. But then throughout the journey of my research, I realized that, you know, a lot of local prison building is also adopted with a motive to boost the local economy, or there's a profit motive there, and it's all intertwined, and it's not just targeting one aspect of the system, but stepping back the system in its entirety. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Shull, and thank you for managing that first question in the Q&A. So let's open it up. Please raise your hand or type the question into the Q&A, and I will call on you. As we wait for questions, I think I kind of wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Eagly had said, which was, I mean, how much do you think that this kind of contrast between what the rhetoric that's happening at the national level and the policy line versus what's happening really on the ground? How much is that unique to the Reagan era versus it doesn't sound like anything has changed from my perspective. And how much do you think this persists to this day?
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's really important to acknowledge, even though my book zeroes in on Reagan is in the title, you know, there's definitely a focus on what was new and unique about the Reagan administration's right turn. It's very important to acknowledge how U.S. immigration and foreign policy really has been a bipartisan consensus, and is built upon by past and subsequent administrations. And so I spend a lot of time in the book. In the first 3 chapters, you know, my first chapter, I look at, it's called Constructing the Carceral Palimpsest, looking at the longer history and the settler colonial foundations of the detention system, and these kind of episodic enactments of detention, you know, including Japanese incarcerations during World War II. And I especially dwell on the 1960s and 70s, and the kind of civil rights era and the era of decolonization and rising global freedom struggles, and the kind of growing backlash against that Reagan becomes a figurehead of. And thinking of Dylan Rodriguez's book, White Reconstruction, is a great term for that phenomenon. But I also, in chapters 1 and 2, when I talk about the Carter administration quite a lot. And there's a lot of parallels between Carter and what I'm seeing under the Biden administration today. And these kind of more softer, gentler forms of US empire, and an emphasis on human rights and humanitarianism that really helped pave the way for Reagan's right turn. Carter's treatment, systematic rejection of Haitian asylum seekers, and the foreign policy kind of groundwork laid that then I mentioned Giuliani picking up on, you know, really helped enable the totalitarianism and horrific conditions that Haitians were facing, and underlines the anti-Black racism that really is a common undercurrent well before Reagan, and always across US history. And then the Mariel Cuban case is particularly instructive, and I should have kind of dwelled on it more during my talk, and especially Carter's response in 1980 during an election year. The political fallout from that was immense, and maybe one key reason that Carter was not reelected. And rather than adhering to the newly passed 1980 Refugee Act, which passed, I think, in April of 1980, and the Mariel Cuban migration began in April and May of 1980, they were not allowed to avail themselves of the Refugee Act, which attempted to broaden the application of access to asylum seeking. And instead, Mariel Cubans and Haitians were granted this indefinite legal status, which resulted for Cubans in their indefinite detention, which, you know, the book concludes with the riotous unrest of the uprisings of 1987. But this liminal space that they were in on military bases, which became increasingly punitive, enabled the kind of growth and entrenchment of detention and the criminalization of asylum seeking as this became a media sensation. And then Reagan comes in, you know, kind of convinced of the need to kind of double down and crack down on this, which is deemed out of control. And, you know, Stephen Miller under Trump, you know, was often referring to the Mariel Cuban migration as disastrous for, you know, US image and foreign policy and immigration policy. And that also allowed for this indefinite detention of Mariel Cubans who themselves were at the intersections of all of the threats that Reagan was articulating. Communism, crime, sexual deviance, social dependency, the drug trade, Blackness, and at the center geographically of the Caribbean basin, this threat in the Reagan imaginary that really coalesces together, and it allows for the collapsing of undocumented, refugee, criminal categories. But what was unique about Reagan is what I'm really trying to emphasize in the book. Reagan is both a continuation and a culmination of past trends. And so I love the concept of palimpsest because it enables us to hold, you know, what was inherited from the past and what also is kind of a new contribution. Reagan and Giuliani, for example, and William French Smith, the Attorney General, they really lauded the immigration policy of the 1920s, the enactment of quotas, the reification of white supremacy in immigration law. And they really talked about wanting to bring that back and underline it. But then that becomes just kind of a given in immigration debates and policymaking ever since. And so thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few questions, a few hands up. So let's go straight to Chiara Maritado.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for this fascinating presentation. Congratulations also for the book again. And my questions was precisely on this carceral palimpsests, which actually you are also developing now. Concerning more present time and today, actually, how can we then also define and identify this palimpsest? Palimpsest is also, concerning some practices and precise forms of actions as well. So if you could, for instance, give some examples about today palimpsests in Detention Empire in the US, what kind of examples you would provide? And those also to complete the questions before on today and how you could define that today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's funny because my dissertation advisor, Emily Rosenberg, you know, at first was kind of hesitant about me bringing this concept, and I went to UCLA as an undergrad, and I actually first heard the term palimpsest in Eric Avila's History of Los Angeles course. And in reference to the freeway system in Los Angeles that developed on the streetcar system that developed on the Mission Trail system. And so just this idea, like architecturally, so physically and geographically as a concept, the way that prison sites, some examples being, I'm thinking of the Northwest Detention Center in Seattle that is sited on a Superfund site. So there are environmental dimensions there. I'm thinking of El Centro, which Jessica Ordaz talks about in her book, The Shadow of El Centro, which is an amazing history of the El Centro Detention Center, how it was built, you know, out of material from Japanese incarceration camps and built by migrant labor, and then it transforms in various ways. There's facilities in Texas. The Port Isabel facility I mentioned in my book, it was first it was a military site, and then it was a Border Patrol kind of training site, and then it became a School of the Americas training site that brought you know, military from El Salvador and other Latin American nations to the United States, and then to deal out death squad violence, 10, 20 years later, and displacing migrants who are then it becomes an immigration detention site in the 70s and 80s. And so thinking about those layered histories to kind of understand how in one place there can be, all of these histories that build upon each other, or how migrant children today are detained on military bases, is another example, and the environmental dimensions of that, like at Homestead in South Florida. But I think not just geographically, I think it's a helpful concept. It's also a literary concept. It's also a literary concept about narratives that get layered on top of one another, and literal scripted writing. And so I'm recalling another example of the poetry etched on the walls in Angel Island in San Francisco Bay that is whitewashed and then uncovered. And so again, not just the physical manifestations of the ways in which detention and prison sites can be used for various functions, the way that prison sites, detain citizens incarcerated for commission of certain crimes and, immigrants, but also the stories and how the stories reverberate across time, and then the practices, the prose of counterinsurgency, the state's official language, which is repeated across time in different contexts. I brought up the environment because that has been a new direction in my research recently, looking at how migration overlaps with the climate crisis, just hearing environmental stories of people who have been affected by detention, and thinking about how today's the Biden administration, the way that they articulate climate change as potentially this impending mass migration crisis and we're going to apply a humanitarian response, but the United States is still going to remain hegemonic in that response, and we're still going to apply border enforcement responses. It completely echoes Reagan's rhetoric about the need to contain communism and respond to a perceived mass migration. So palimpsest also can refer to those scripts or those stories and the rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we have Tatiana Castillo Ramos.
There. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book, and again, congrats.
Yeah,
I'd like to return to the sanctuary movement, which I know has been talked about a bit, and as well as like the criticisms both from within and outside of the movement. But one of the long-term, kind of legacies of this movement that it's most known for is kind of highlighting the voices of, particularly picked refugees and asylum seekers, but to raise political awareness. I know you mentioned some helping to organize those hunger strikes, but I was wondering if I'd like to hear a little bit more about how this movement was particularly involved in like this history of detention centers themselves. Like, I thought I saw a slide on there about like sanctuary break-ins, but so that's just one question. And the second question I had was, can you also compare like the sanctuary movement's approaches to the Central American solidarity movement? Because I know that was brought up, and I'm just curious as to how they had different approaches, what you found in your research. I had different approaches to like protesting detention centers. Was there a lot of overlap? I'd just be interested in hearing a comparison. Again, I'm very excited to read this. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been focusing more recently since publishing the book on the sanctuary movement and researching it further and kind of its continuation to the present day and its resurgence, in the late 2000s. Around the time that I was impacted by this and started working around detention, just in response to, the ramping up of border enforcement, especially post 9/11. And so yes, the sanctuary movement, I'm very concerned. I write quite a bit in, I think it's in chapter 5, about the messiness of the movement and that tension of storytelling. And that's something that I'm also very concerned with. And I published a chapter recently in a book, Abolition Feminisms, Volume 1 with Haymarket Press, where I kind of question, as I said at the end of my talk, the tactic of storytelling. And, you know, there's been some really great scholarship critiquing the sanctuary movement, but what's so interesting about it is that it was very self-aware and self-reflective in the moment. And there was, of course, a lot of infighting and messiness, as there is in all social movement organizing. And so the sanctuary movement originated as a response to detention. In the story of how the sanctuary movement emerged, Jim Corbett, the Quaker in Tucson, Arizona, was accompanying people, Salvadorans who were detained at the El Centro facility, and more locally, and raising money to bond them out, and confronted something similar to what I did when I first, became aware of the detention system as a white US-born privileged citizen, lacking awareness of how detention operates. The INS officers lying, tearing up paperwork, transferring people across facilities, which Ingrid mentioned, as a tactic to punish and deflect, deporting people before they can have due process. And so the sanctuary movement, that kind of sparked this desire to adopt civil disobedience response. And in the language of and Jim Corbett and John Fife, who is another pastor, and those were seen as kind of the founders of the sanctuary movement, even though that's been challenged because these kind of resistance efforts really popped up everywhere there was detention always, and local coalitional organizing. And so but in their language of announcing sanctuary, they said, if the US government is not going to adhere to its own law, then we aren't going to, we're going to shelter people. So the religious and moral, and also critique of foreign policy that was part of the initial impetus of the sanctuary movement. It was written about extensively. It was debated in very heated venues, but by, and I talk about this in my book, mostly white US actors who were kind of seen as leaders of the movement. And the movement kind of splinters between Tucson and the more religious focus, and Chicago, that becomes an organizing base for sanctuary, and that has a more kind of political and a liberation theology, and wanting to really make a criticism of US foreign policy central to the movement. And that's where you get these really tensions between whose stories are we going to tell, who are we going to shelter? Often it was someone who was chosen, and this continues to this day. And what I've seen in a lot of organizing over the last 10 years is, choosing someone who is a mother with children, who might be a more sympathetic figure, someone who doesn't have a criminal record. There were instances where the sanctuary movement refused to shelter people fleeing, the National Guard, police forces of El Salvador, because it was, having to take political sides. And so looking into that and how problematic that can be, and how that, I can't diagnose something as like a failure or a victory, but it kind of didn't really help in a lot of ways. And so looking into that more, I think, is really important. And there's a lot of scholars now that are revisiting sanctuary, especially in light of the present day, and really becoming, aware. So some questions I'm asking in my research now are, what happens to the critique of, like, centering the critique of US foreign policy and militarism, and the effects of US imperialism abroad in displacing people? That seems to have kind of fallen out of a lot of, at least DC and Beltway immigrant rights organizing over the last 10, 15 years. And instead, like, just a focus on someone having an empathetic story or being deserving, hasn't really helped to challenge these regimes. So how and why that kind of happened. Did the sanctuary movement really die out in the 1990s and come back in the late 2000s? Not really. I'm finding a lot of organizers shifted their work abroad. And it continued to be transnational, organizing against NAFTA and against labor exploitation, and that continuation of critiquing U.S. foreign policy continues to happen. The relationship between sanctuary and Central American peace movement, yeah, these were two kind of separate but converging. I would say the larger umbrella of a Central American peace movement. Sanctuary was one arm, within it, and maybe the most visible in the media because of the prominence of U.S. and white actors in it, and of church people and the religious and moral kind of center of the movement. Whereas Central American peace movement was largely led, out of San Francisco and Los Angeles by Salvadoran migrant groups, and connecting with other longstanding, resistance movements that connect to global freedom struggles, and leftist movements that have just been less visible, at least in the media in the 1980s. So I hope that kind of answers some of your questions. Those were really big, great questions.
Oh, no, that's great. I'd love to keep in contact after this. Thank you so much.
Please reach out. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so next we have Roger Weldinger.
Yes, hi. So thanks, Tina, for this terrific presentation. Thanks, Ingrid, for the comment. I guess I want to first pick up on your point, Tina, about the continuity in policy, and I was struck by a comment you made a moment ago, talking about the Jim Corbett and the original sanctuary leaders there in Tucson, emphasizing that the U.S. needed to adhere to its own legal commitments, that the policies that the Reagan administration was pursuing in conflict with U.S. legal commitments. But isn't there really, precisely there an element of discontinuity? I mean, in the end, the asylum was a new practice. I mean, asylum was newly embedded in U.S. immigration law with the Refugee Act of 1980, and as far as I can tell, it was a relatively minor aspect of the Refugee Act of 1980. I mean, almost all of the attention was placed on resettlement and Congress's interest in trying to grasp or to regain control over resettlement from the executive. But up until then, asylum had been a relatively minor phenomenon. And I mean, I'm not a historian, but my reading of the literature is that asylum was embedded into U.S. law in a relatively absent-minded way, without policymakers really understanding what the long-term consequences would be. And then it suddenly exploded. I mean, you have relatively low levels of asylum applications in the 1970s. I mean, we're talking about 4 or 5 digits maximum. And then it very, very rapidly expands. Of course, I mean, Mariel is the first major incident of mass asylum seeking. And the assumption had been that, again, that's my reading of the historical literature, may be wrong, that asylum numbers would remain small, and all of a sudden they explode. And furthermore, that in the Refugee Act of 1980, there was no, in fact, in the hearing, there had been no discussion of implementation. So one had, on the one hand, the embedding of the convention into U.S. law, which in turn is what provided the leverage to the legal advocates in the 1980s. Without the Refugee Act of 1980, there would be no basis, I believe, for decisions such as Orantes, which in the end was reasonably protective. But you had both an administration as well as an agency, the INS, that was totally unwilling to accept to accept the obligations that they were committed to as a result of the law. So I guess my question is it really a story of continuity, or isn't this more a moment in which the legal terrain fundamentally shifts, in which, despite what seems to be the fairly pessimistic story that you're telling, one in which migrants and their advocates actually obtained significant rights and leverage that they didn't previously possess, and used it to get a lot more protection than the administration would have liked, despite all of its repressive efforts. I mean, in the end, several 100,000 Salvadorans managed to find their way to the United States. I mean, the Salvadoran population increased about over 300,000 between 1980 and 1990, despite all of the things that the Reagan administration tried to do to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I think it's both and. That's a fantastic question and observation. I think there is this rupturous moment with the Reagan administration. I would highly recommend the work of Yenle Espiritu and Jana Lippman on Vietnamese refugee resettlement in the 1970s. And I discuss it a little bit in my book because talking about palimpsest, the like Fort Chaffee detention site where Mariel Cubans were held had recently, detained Vietnamese refugees for resettlement. But you're right that there wasn't, asylum seekers were not in really high number until a later time period. And that's because of US Cold War kind of foreign policy and just practice of granting refugee status quite routinely to only those nations, fleeing communism. And then the Refugee Act in 1980 passes right when there's this promised sea change and adherence to international, refugee, the Refugee Convention of 1967 and the expansion of access to asylum pathways to those beyond just those fleeing communism. But then the Reagan administration does not adhere to that. And so, yeah, the legal cases that you mentioned, Orantes Hernandez versus Smith in 1982, and then ultimately American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg in 1991, which grants several 100,000 Salvadorans and Guatemalans TPS status. Although I would still point out that there were so many who were deported or who perished in the wars before. It's a little bit late in coming, but in that question of achieving justice and due process. And as Ingrid pointed out, especially in the case of Orantes, the order, they ordered the INS to adhere to the 1980 refugee law, but they didn't exactly adhere to it. And I talk about that in chapter 4 of my book, which is the Central American chapter. And I say that the 1980 Act was actually weaponized by the Reagan administration because they were able to point to it to enact a blanket rejection of Salvadoran and Guatemalan migrants, because by saying they're providing equal access to due process with this new kind of procedure through the 1980 law. So it's like what it looks like on the face versus what actually happens on the ground. And that is where in the world of immigration detention, that's just very familiar. There's so much deviance from what is ordered, even by the Supreme Court or the other branches of the government, and what actually happens on the ground. But overall, yes, access to asylum is expanding during this time, and these are particular groups they're emblematic of the criminalization of asylum seeking that I talk about, and the media attention focused on them, and the attention focused on them by detention policymakers, just as a rationale for detention. The policy of we can't trust people who are asylum seekers, so we need to detain them systematically, all of them. You know, and I have documents from the archives where that language is written down in handwriting, like detain all asylum seekers, question mark, after in the wake of Mariel. That really just, yeah, it makes it a lot messier into this time period. And so that is why I think the Reagan administration is exceptional for adding that complication or that layer.
So, sorry.
No, I was going to open it up if anyone else had more to add on that question.
Well, we do have a question in the Q&A and then one more hand up, so I wanted to get to those. So in the Q&A, amazing talk, Dr. Shull from Yareli Castro Sevilla. I always learn so much from you. Can you speak a little more about the role of intersectional coalition building to the seeds of resistance you write about? What relationships and networks stand out in the official and unofficial archives you discovered?
Oh, thank you for this question. And hi, Yareli. Yareli was a student with me at Harvard, and I believe a fellow at CCIS. So it's wonderful to have you here. This is a great question. There's where I got this concept of seeds of resistance. It comes from, you know, Assata Shakur's poem about seeds growing into sprouts and sprouts growing into trees, just kind of emblematic. But there was this quote that I cite in my introduction, and this is a Guatemalan man who is testifying in Sanctuary 1984. And he says, I know my words are like seeds in the ground, and later we will be able to harvest good fruit in the future. There are certain things that unite all Guatemalans. All of us, Latinos or Indians, are poor, oppressed, and have the same problems. White, brown, barefoot, shoes on, sandals, we are all screwed. I kind of end the introduction of the book with that quote and this concept of my words are like seeds. And I thought that was so striking and powerful. And that was one impetus for my belief in the practice of archiving. And I have a chapter forthcoming this spring in a book co-edited by Arturo Aldama and Jessica Ordaz. The title is blanking on me. I might put it in the chat if I can think of it. But it's called Resistance Archiving, and it's about the kind of practice of capturing testimonies and documenting them and archiving them in various ways, whether they're posted online in an online archive blog, like I've created as a Soros Justice Fellow with Freedom for Immigrants. I created a blog called Imprint that shares people's stories from detention so that they can be unmediated, unedited. They don't need to go through an editor in legacy media. They don't need to go through, you know, scholarly review or selected by a politician to make a stand for a particular policy, but just for stories to be shared. But it can be in so many other formats. Just the practice of collecting oral histories themselves, the practice of visiting someone in detention and witnessing and of accompaniment and testifying to that is something that we can all do. You don't have to be a trained historian to participate in those kinds of practices, and the power of that in challenging, you know, state narratives. So some of the powerful examples of that I saw in researching this book, I mentioned the Coalition Off Our Backs, which was a feminist publication in the 1970s and 80s, where they visited Haitian women who were imprisoned at Alderson, West Virginia, in a federal prison facility, and published their testimonies, their kind of poetry, their words, the letters that people wrote to the US government, and the work of, you know, allies on the outside, and this kind of practice of inside-outside organizing, which is taking the lead of people on the inside and, you know, being in solidarity with them to and not making decisions about how their stories are shared on their behalf. But serving as a kind of middleman to connect people. But the work that they did to, they talked about being in solidarity with Mariel Cuban, asylum seekers or refugees, when many other immigrant rights groups at the time distanced themselves from Mariel Cubans because they often appealed to more pro-US. They didn't all have like this kind of leftist or liberation theology thing, or a lot of, the sanctuary movement, one of its fatal flaws, many scholars say, is that they singularly focused on Salvadorans and Guatemalans. And only later in the 1990s did they build solidarity with Haitian asylum-seeking groups and others. Although the Off Our Backs Coalition, the feminist coalition, emphatically said we need to be in solidarity, with all peoples and all asylum seekers, and recognize the impact of U.S. imperialism in all places around and across the global South. And then another example would be Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, who ran for presidency in 1984. And at the time, Cornel West called it the most important challenge to the U.S. left ever waged, or since the anti-Vietnam War movement. And he was the only presidential candidate who openly criticized, U.S. foreign policy and U.S. intervention in Central American civil wars. And he went on a kind of speaking tour, and I think he forfeited not that he was likely to win the presidency to begin with, but during campaign season in June of 1980, he left the United States and he went on a multi-country kind of touring through Central America and to Cuba, and negotiated for prisoner exchanges. And he made connections. He talked about Japanese incarcerations during World War II. He talked about U.S. imperialism and oppression across time and space. So those are some examples of some of this kind of broader coalition building that I saw in my work that I thought was really, really, I think, exciting and hopeful. I've also seen the opposite. As I mentioned, I've seen, kind of disappointing separations between groups and causes. And that's just, again, organizing is extremely messy and political, and that happens time and time again. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. So back to the hands up. We next have a question from Immaculada Garcia Sanchez.
Hi, Dr. Shull. Thank you very much for your presentation and your book, and to Ingrid for her comments. And I actually wanted to pick up a thread. Like you've talked about a little bit about that in your presentation, but also Ingrid made reference to it, and also it's come up in some of the answers in the Q&A, which is the thread of asylum seekers' stories and how they become these narrative artifacts that then circulate across time and spaces. And in particular, I wanted to ask, when I was listening to you with this idea that the asylum claim itself, when you were talking about that, how the migrants enacted resistance at every point, and that part of that was the asylum claim itself, was both very surprising and very exciting to me. And it was very surprising mostly because of my own disciplinary, where I situate myself disciplinarily, which is linguistic anthropology, when some of my colleagues who work directly with refugees, and they're actually doing micro-ethnographic documentation of how these claims are produced. And, like all the administrative barriers, and, they actually talk of the opposite. They actually talk of refugees and asylum seekers, in a sense, being subjected to narrative inequality, because the conditions in which they have to produce these stories sometimes make them out to be less credible, and less sympathetic that maybe their cases. are really married and are. I would love to hear you talk about more about how the claims themselves can be and were used as a site of resistance, and what we can learn from that in the realm of immigrant advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's such important work. Yeah, there's really important scholarship on how asylum claims and the court system enacts violence in these ways that you're describing. One example of where I discuss, or I say that asylum claims can be a site of resistance is the story of a Mariel Cuban named Fidel Armando Toboso Alfonso, who was a Mariel Cuban who came in 1980, and then he was released, and then he was detained, which was very common because they were incredibly profiled and heavily policed, especially in Miami. And he was re-imprisoned in, I think, 1985. And he filed an asylum claim as a persecuted category as a gay man. And it ended up becoming, I think, the first successful claim that established being queer or trans as a persecuted group under asylum law. And his case, I think, was decided not until 1990. And homosexuality was still grounds for inadmissibility until 1991 in immigration law. And so this was really groundbreaking. And he was able to demonstrate that the Cuban government was systematically tracking and discriminating, against queer and trans people. And so that's one example. Another is, yeah, and I think that more recently one of the reasons I would, in my last response, when I was talking about kind of the impetus for archiving and kind of documenting and creating spaces that are depoliticized or that are unedited, because a historical archive that is housed in an institution, including a university, can still be problematic. It's still, owned and operated by an institution that itself may be problematic. Once those are donated to that place, it may not, it may be very difficult for someone to change their mind and have that removed. And those were some of the challenges that I ran up against when I was doing that work with Freedom for Immigrants, over the last 8 years. And so it's really difficult, but seeing time and time again and hearing people share about how difficult it is to have to replay your story and how that reanimates trauma. And you have to also, your story has to adhere to the law. It has to adhere to the confines of the definition of what would qualify for refugee status. And I became more interested in this in my recent work looking at climate and migration and, environmental factors as a cause of displacement, or how they intersect with political and economic explanations, and how it might appear in someone's story, and how people might downplay something that doesn't qualify you for refugee status because there is no protection for climate refugees in US or international law. And so that definitely has an impact on the story that you tell, and trying to have it fit in is really problematic. I have someone just gave me, I have a cache of asylum claims from the 1990s from Guatemala, and I'm looking through them, and I want to ask that question of, yes, how can sites of resistance be seen, in a testimony for an asylum claim that is seen as being really, part of the state apparatus and can be, a form of violence in and of itself. So yeah, and if anyone is doing that work or would like to be in conversation with me about that, please reach out. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat that I think paraphrasing is asking about whether anybody has looked into the views of the children or the grandchildren of participants in the Sanctuary or Central American Solidarity movement.
That's such a great research question. I want to embark on a new kind of oral history project around sanctuary. And that question of that earlier question I posed about what happened to the anti-war movement through 9/11 and beyond and into today, because it just seems that that kind of foreign policy emphasis has dropped out in not entirely. There are many organizations and scholars and that are extremely aware and continue to speak very loudly about the need to critique and identify U.S. foreign policy as a driver of displacement and migration. But that being such a focus for the sanctuary movement in the 80s, and I'm wondering, intergenerationally, how those narratives have continued. So yes, I see, James, I would love to pursue that or be in conversation with you further about that if you have ideas, because that'd be a great thing to interview people about.
And a thumbs up from James. So on that note, I would like to thank everybody for your engagement and participation today. I want to thank Dr. Shull and Dr. Eagly again. I want to thank Roger Waldinger, my partner in the East Coast sponsorships. Our next remote event is Friday, February 2nd at 12 noon Pacific, a book talk from Bridget Haas from Case Western Reserve University, who will be giving a talk on her book, Suspended Lives, Navigating Everyday Violence in the U.S. Asylum System. I see one late hand up. We have about 3 minutes. Sergey Kachasrian.
Yes, that's me. Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late. I just want to ask, I'm an undergraduate student with a personal connection to the matters discussed in the book. Could you share any advice or guidance on how individuals like me can actively support and contribute to those who are facing the challenges that we were just discussing? What can we do?
That's a great question, and it's so nice to meet you, Sergey. A lot of my work has, especially more recently since publishing the book, has been in collaboration with students, especially undergraduate students. So finding organizations, I would really start local, finding organizations that support immigrants or that work on related issues. I've been working in Charlotte, for example, with various organizations. Many of them work on environmental issues, but they collaborate with legal aid and immigrant rights groups to support asylum seekers who are either settling in Charlotte or passing through. Charlotte is kind of a hub for the busing that infamously, Greg Abbott in Texas has been increasing and kind of sending people from the US-Mexico border to cities across the nation, kind of intentionally targeting democratic cities like New York and Chicago. But Charlotte is either a hub or it's a stopping off point. So there are organizations locally that show up at the bus station and just make sure people have food and see if they need anything or try to get them their connection on their way. And that kind of work is I think needed right now everywhere. You can ask professors who are working on these issues if they know of organizations that may be in need of support. One thing that I really enjoyed doing when I was collaborating with Freedom for Immigrants is forming some internship opportunities for undergraduate students to support the work of the organization. And in my case, we had undergraduate students at Cal State Long Beach and UC Irvine that were, it's very fraught to, you know, maybe ask someone to go to a detention site, and you know, there's legality and status and issues around that, but there's all kinds of other work that can be done more behind the scenes, in terms of research, helping with archiving, helping with translation, transcribing interviews, and you know, in different disciplines have different, you know, things that you could help with. And so look for community engaged research that's happening at your institution. Ask your colleagues, your friends, your professors, you know, if there's any way you can get support, and keep an eye open for internship opportunities, maybe summer internship, or what is it, spring break abroad. There's a lot of universities that, you know, take students to the border, you know, during spring break, things like that. So yeah, and feel free to reach out to me via email. I'll put my email in the chat again for everybody before we end. Just feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to talk with anyone further.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Claire, Ingrid, Roger, Warren, everyone at CCIS and UCLA.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. Have
Bye.
a good afternoon.